Judith Juma is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya with professional background in election monitoring and observation. She has participated in various local election observation missions, including the 2013 and 2022 parliamentary, gubernatorial, and presidential general elections in Kenya.
Thank you so much, Nteranya, for the introduction. Please confirm you can hear me.
Confirmed.
Thank you so much. Thank you also, Godson, for your presentation. I think a lot of things came up from it, including voter apathy, which is something I will speak a bit about, and the question of a public office that is supposed to be a trust held for the benefit of the people, and the place of digital technology in elections, which I think we can handle during the Q&A. Allow me to recognize the presence of Mr. Clifford Odero, who is joining me on this forum and was part of my election observation delegation in Homa Bay County, Kenya, in the just concluded 2022 election. Sazi Kizito from Uganda, who is an M&D specialist and is keen on electioneering processes in Uganda, and really helped me in analyzing political environment in Homa Bay during my mandate. I will share my screen shortly. Okay. You can see my screen, right?
Yeah, yes, you can.
Okay, thank you so much. So the approach I am taking in this presentation is to, first of all, discuss how should elections work, how do elections work, and how would we like elections to work. In this sense, we mean what is the future of elections in Africa in the context of emerging areas. In that sense, I will handle these thematic areas. I will give a historical perspective of elections. I will also talk about current ideals in African countries, how elections work from an observer's perspective, and a code of conduct that binds election observers, then proceed to emerging areas and hopefully provide recommended readings. Now, in terms of a historical perspective, I chose 2 African countries who have had unique circumstances when it comes to elections in their context. And I would first like to say that even before colonization in African countries, and the major distinguishing factor is that they were communal in nature. For example, in Ethiopia, there was what was called a Gada system, and I'm made to understand the Gada system still exists in Ethiopia, which is used to elect the Aba Gada, who is a leader of the Oromo people found in Ethiopia. And this system operates in a way that voting is done by fathers and sons who are put in age groups, and it is usually rotational, such that when age group 1 votes, the next time it will be age group 2 to choose a leader, age group 3, like that, and then we come until we come back to age group 1, where they have the task to again choose elect an Aba Gada. And bear in mind that Ethiopia is one of the countries that was never colonized, so some of their traditional voting systems are still in place to date. The second country, Ghana, which had one of the oldest kingdoms, the Ashanti Kingdom, where they would elect an Asante Hene. Ghana is one of the countries that had the earliest legislative and executive structures, and in this sense, the Asante Hene would be voted for by the people after nomination by a female from the royal line. Then on to the colonial era, where I wish I could remove this. The colonial era, where the colonialists introduced the concept of national elections and voting. And basically, what elections meant to the African people was to have legislative representation of Africans in the European parliaments that were set up in African countries. And later, Africans used the concept colonial rule, and eventually this worked out in the walk towards independence. Fast forward to the independence era, there was the emergence of forms of government. There was the rise of one-party systems, in which those who attained independence and were chosen as presidents would want to secure power and reward loyalty to their supporters. And fast forward, there was the rise of military rule, whose earlier functions was to overthrow dictatorship. And then the rise of multi-party systems in African countries, which basically worked to eliminate one-party systems and gave birth to political parties and independent candidates. And I have put the arrow down there just to show you that to date, African countries move back and forth between one-party systems to military rules and to multi-party systems. Now, discussing the question of how should elections work, which is basically what is the ideal situations that African states have accepted. And this, I looked at international laws that African countries have accepted to be applicable in their countries, in addition to national laws that they have passed in their countries. And I've given just a few examples of treaties that have been passed by signed by African countries. And one very unique one is the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, which was like the first document that African leaders felt the need to enact through the African Union that would contextualize the situation in Africa. However, that being said, I must say that that document national laws say on elections. And on this slide, I just gave examples of key features that can be found in those documents. And one is which Godson has greatly talked about in terms of the will of the people, which is the concept of sovereignty of the people, whereby we have the power to choose who should lead us. The issue of non-discrimination, the issue of one person should have one vote, the question of freedom of association, the issue of a secret ballot, whereby whoever you vote for should not be, no one should intimidate you to reveal who you vote for, existence of independent electoral bodies, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of how elections work, from an election observer's perspective, I have highlighted key activities that happen for the observer and even for the electoral body. I begin by saying that the election process is usually the mandate of an independent electoral body. And an election is not an event. An election is a process. And that's why we say elections actually do not begin on the voting day. Elections begin usually in preceding activities, like Godson mentioned. We have party nominations, we have campaigns, we have voter education, we have voter register verification and the registration of voters. Also, that includes registration of political candidates. Again, the processes on the voting day, and then we have post-election processes, which entail counting of the votes, tallying, and announcements of results. All these are supposed to be done by an independent electoral body that does not have the control by other arms of government. So problems arise from the get-go in African states where number one, there are no independent electoral bodies at all, or if the bodies are there, they are controlled mostly by the executive. Then problems arise from that point. Now, on to becoming an election observer, the first thing that happens is an advertisement or a call for expression of interest as an election observer. And this advert usually includes the call for electoral analysts, legal analysts, and gender analysts, which are key concepts that crop up during election. Thirdly, we have accreditation of the election observers or the entire delegation of election observers. And without this, no election observer or a delegation has access to any polling or tallying station. I must point out that during elections, it is usually the election body that is in charge, and therefore accreditation is actually given by the electoral body. And this accreditation is not just given to election observers, it is also given to political party agents who are allowed into the polling stations. It is given to security officers who must report now to the electoral body. Fourthly, what happens is the training of election observers or monitors. This is a process that is usually done in-house by the appointing body that is deploying election observers. They have the responsibility to train their observers. And training in this sense means training on internationally recognized codes of conduct and the electoral laws that govern a particular country. So for example, in my case, my team and I, we were trained on Kenya's Electoral Code of Conduct. We were trained on Kenya's Political Parties Act, which gives information and guidance on how an election observer should conduct themselves. And key to that is the question of impartiality and independence from no influence over the outcome of elections or the process itself. After that training, there is now the deployment of the trained election observers in key select regions of a given country. And usually this depends on the budget, either of a government or the NGO. And if they have a good budget, they could deploy countrywide in all regions. And sometimes even in a particular region, they can deploy more than one. After that, there is preparation of election observation tools, including the use of a digital app. This usually helps in recording the observations that one makes during the electioneering period. So for example, in my case, we had tools like campaign monitoring tool, we had a voter education monitoring tool, we had the voting day activities tool, where my team and I would throughout the process of election. The other one is introduction to election stakeholders and the involvement in election dialogue and stakeholder engagement. Usually this helps observers to gain the scenario around the area. It is in this kind of forums that you get to know of security concerns. You get to know whether the region where you are is a volatile region, and other security measures that are in place by the government are usually highlighted in those fora. Now, how do elections work? Now we're looking at the voting day. From an observer's perspective, an election observer arrives at the polling station way before voting starts. So in Kenya, for example, voting usually begins at 6 a.m. Myself, on the voting day, I was at the polling station, I think by 5 a.m. And the importance of this is to observe the processes that begin before voting, which include the sealing and unsealing of ballot boxes, including inspection, checking for accreditation of election body officials that are at the polling station, checking whether, of course, political party agents are accredited, or are we having busybodies, quote unquote, at the polling station, the presence of security officers. Now, the actual exercise of an election observer on the voting day is now to monitor the voting process. And this includes checking the assistance that is given to persons with disabilities, special interest groups, such as mothers accompanied by children and pregnant women. Fourthly is incidences of youth incitement or refusal to leave the polling station. And again, as per the code of conduct of election observers, impartiality and independence of the observer is key. Now, for example, an election observer is not supposed to advise a voter on who to vote for, or even to direct them on how to vote. If they approach an observer, that observer is supposed to direct that voter to the next election agent at the station and not take up that role by themselves. The picture that you're seeing in the screen, which I'm trying to zoom in, I got it from our electoral body in Kenya, which actually highlights the voting process in Kenya, starting by the time a voter enters the polling station, the documentation that they provide. You can see people, that person on a wheelchair being assisted. You can see the presence of the media. You can see an agent and an observer seated, watching closely the process. Oops, okay. I'm trying to get to the next slide. All right. Now, after election observation, the main output of that process is to come up with either with an inception report, which is usually at the beginning of the election exercise, or an end of mission report. In my case, my team, we used to do periodic reports, both weekly and monthly, on the observations we were making, because we were, in the strict sense, long-term election observers. And these reports usually inform policy and legislative dialogue or changes. I've given an example of the Carter Center report of 2017, which informed administrative and legislative changes in Kenya's 2022 elections, and the IEBC duly acknowledged that in their report. Secondly, election observation helps in suggesting areas that require future election advocacy initiatives with the community. And sometimes election observation experiences can be used in a court of law as evidence in election petitions. Now, other than the voting process, election does not end, election observation normally does not end after declaration of results. Now, there is an aspect of post-election observation, which mainly entails monitoring the psychology of voters after election. Do they accept the results? Do they engage in violence? What actions do they take after that? And this also includes recording incidences of violence and corruption from the onset when campaigns were ongoing on the voting day, incidences of voter bribery, and whether some political agents continue to campaign either on the voting day or after election. The other thing that election observation entails is the monitoring of the process and outcome of election petitions. I must say, even in Kenya, I think we are around 7 months after election, and still there are cases that are ongoing in court. However, because my mandate as an election observer ended, I have not been reporting on that, but for purposes of interest, I have been following. The other aspect that my team and I monitored was the swearing in exercises of key leaders in counties. Now, on this slide, I talk about challenges that come with election observation. The first one being that sometimes you're required to observe elections in a very large terrain. And for example, in Kenya, in the 2022 elections, there were a total of 47,229 polling stations countrywide, against an average of 337 election observers that were deployed by the organization that engaged me. The truth is 337 cannot observe all the 47,000 polling stations. So that leaves the question, if I provide a report, is it a true representation of the entirety of elections in the country? Again, I understand monitoring and evaluation aspects of sampling and using a sampling method to represent the whole. But again, thinking around it, there are organizations, for example, that actually choose 3 regions out of the 47 regions in Kenya, and they provide a report terming it a representation of the elections. And that calls into question, does 3 regions represent the entirety of an election? The second concern or challenge was security concerns as a result of violence at the polling stations and during campaigns. Myself, I was a victim of tear gas canisters being lodged at a place where I was observing elections. I remember Cliff, my colleague here, reported on a candidate whose home was raided in one of the regions of Homa Bay. The third thing is rising cases of sexual and gender-based violence. Before, during, and after elections, there have been such instances, and sometimes, or most times, they are underreported, or the actions taken by police are, in a sense, very slow, and sometimes no action is actually taken after reporting. Then there's violence against women and men in politics. This is in terms of those vying for political seats. There are those who are usually blackmailed even to pull out of the race, and it becomes discouraging for candidates. And this is something that is live and ongoing in Kenya mostly, where sometimes candidates are bought, some agree to the buying. There are those who are raided, as I've mentioned, and they pull out of the race. So it becomes discouraging that elections in Kenya is for a chosen few election seats. Fifth challenge is that the majority of election officials, in my observations, are not properly trained on the use of digital devices during the voting day. And also the other aspect of that is that these digital devices sometimes fail in the middle of the process of voting. And in some instances, this now delays the process of voting, because voting is supposed to end at 6, and you find that in some polling stations, it would go into the night. So that translates to instances of either, ballot stuffing in ballot boxes, or insecurity, security concerns, because it is now night time. Number 6, a voter register verification. The register of voters verification that we saw was not properly verified. The exercise was not properly done. In this sense, the number of registered voters versus the statistics given after elections normally does not tally. It's not usually a free reflection of those who voted. And sometimes even the use of the voter register to verify someone as a voter requires, like in Kenya, the capturing of the biometric fingerprint. And because of lack of proper voter education, some voters assume that if you take their digital fingerprint, you will use that to manipulate the system and count it as if they have already voted. And lastly, the aspect of campaign financing for vulnerable groups, which was also one of the subjects that, one of the issues that made political candidates to pull out of the race, because they could not finance their campaigns. And this is common to vulnerable groups, young youths who want to vie for seats, but they cannot finance their campaigns. Now, I listed emerging areas for further discussion or research that came out of the process that I did. The first one being the role of technology in elections, the question of data protection, and the gender digital divide. Now, in terms of technology, I had Godson saying how election transmission processes should be digitized. But at the same time, if we take that conversation further, the weaknesses in technology also influence manipulation of the system to promote vote rigging. And at the same time, when technology fails and there is no backup, either through manual systems, it becomes chaotic. Then there's the aspect of data protection, where citizens are becoming more and more concerned of where their data is taken when it is recorded by their electoral body. There's that question of, is my data protected? Will it be manipulated? And there have been those instances of manipulation in Kenya. Then there's the gender digital divide, in the sense that you find that in certain groups of people, for example, women living in rural areas do not receive proper training on the use of technology when it comes to elections. So on the voting day, when you find that there's resistance in the capturing of the fingerprint, or there's just a misconception around what that technology is supposed to do. Then there's the rise of citizen election observers. In the places where we observed elections, there was a rising movement called Operation Linda Kura. Linda Kura is a Swahili word which means protect your vote. And this would mean voters would refuse to leave the polling stations because they did not trust election officials, and they'll say they will stay there until counting is done and finished. The upside of this is that security officers are supposed to protect the polling station. You're supposed to vote and go home. And so you find it becomes difficult to control a large number of people hanging around the polling stations, which a number of times they're usually organizing a fracas. Then the question of campaign financing, and what about vulnerable groups that cannot finance their campaigns? Should there be policies and laws formulated to provide special funds to help them? These are conversations that are ongoing, not just in Kenya, but other countries. The concept of voter apathy, what really counts as a representation of the will of the people when the majority do not vote? And pictured on this slide, you can see the conversation between the two gentlemen, where one says voting is a waste of time. And at the same time, he complains that idiot voters re-elected the same exact faces of people who are not doing much for the people. Lastly, we need to have more conversations whether democracy really works for Africa. What about countries with hybrid systems? What are the key indicators of a working system, especially in the subject of elections? I have made some recommended readings that informed my research, and I see they have done a lot around elections in Africa. We have Charles Fombard, who has a book called Democracy, Elections, and Constitutionalism in Africa, and Martin Meredith, my favorite author, who has done quite a good job on analyzing political systems in Africa. And for those who are interested in more of the subject of election observation, I have posted websites where you can find information about elections and how that pans out in Africa, including election timelines that are running year in, year out on when elections are held in all countries of Africa. And wow, thank you for listening to me. Thank you so, so much. I'm happy to have questions. I'm happy to have more discussions on this. Thank you so much.